Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to watch your entire world burn around you while you ran for your life? To hear the screams of everyone you've ever known echoing behind you as divine fire rained from heaven itself? Today, we're about to uncover one of the most harrowing and mysterious survival stories ever recorded. A story so shocking, so unbelievable, that it will challenge everything you think you know about divine judgment, human survival, and the power of obedience in the face of absolute terror. You know the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. You've heard about the cities consumed by fire and brimstone, destroyed in a moment of divine wrath. But what if I told you there's a survivor whose story has been hidden in plain sight for thousands of years? Someone who witnessed the unthinkable, escaped the impossible, and lived to tell a tale that most would rather forget. This isn't just another Bible story. This is a testimony of survival that will shake you to your core. His name was Lot, and what happened to him in those final hours before the cities burned is more terrifying and more miraculous than you could ever imagine. Because Lot didn't just escape Sodom. He was literally dragged from the jaws of destruction by beings so powerful that they could blind an entire mob with a single gesture. He witnessed horrors that would break most minds and experienced divine intervention so direct, so personal, that it changed the course of human history. But here's what's truly shocking about Lot's story. He almost didn't make it. Even with angels at his side, even with advance warning of what was coming, even with a direct command from heaven itself, he hesitated. He lingered. He looked back. And that moment of doubt nearly cost him everything. If you've ever felt the pull between safety and familiarity, between doing what's right and doing what's easy, then comment 777 right now. Because Lot's story isn't just ancient history. It's a mirror held up to every choice we make when the stakes are higher than we realize. Every 777 is a declaration that sometimes salvation requires us to run when everything inside us wants to stay. And for those who've supported this revelation through super thanks, you're not just watching a story unfold. You're helping to resurrect truths that have the power to transform lives in ways we're only beginning to understand. Now, stay close, because what we're about to discover will turn everything you thought you knew about Sodom's destruction completely upside down. The angels have arrived, the city is in chaos, and one man's desperate flight from annihilation is about to begin. Sodom's secret survivor, the shocking story of the one who escaped. Picture this. The sun is setting over the Jordan Valley, casting long shadows across the fertile plain that stretches toward the mountains. The air is thick with the sounds of a bustling city, merchants calling out their wares, children playing in the dusty streets, the distant bleating of sheep and goats. This is Sodom at twilight, a city alive with commerce and conversation, completely unaware that in just a few hours it will cease to exist. But there's something different that makes the hair on the back of about this particular evening. Something your neck stand up, even though you can't quite put your finger on what it is. The very atmosphere seems charged with an invisible tension, as if creation itself is holding its breath. In the midst of this ordinary chaos, two strangers approach the city gates. They walk with a purpose that cuts through the evening crowds like a blade through water. Their steps are measured, deliberate, carrying an authority that makes people unconsciously step aside. These aren't ordinary travelers seeking shelter for the night. These are messengers of the Most High, angels of God disguised in human form, carrying out a mission so serious that it will reshape the landscape of human understanding forever. But only one man in the entire city recognizes them for what they truly are. His name is Lot, and he's sitting by the gate as the evening settles over Sodom. Now, here's where the story gets interesting. Lot wasn't born in Sodom. He wasn't even supposed to be there. Years earlier, he had traveled with his uncle Abraham into the Promised Land, following a call from God that would change the destiny of nations. But when the time came to separate their growing herds and households, Lot made a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He looked toward the Jordan Valley, saw its green pastures and flowing rivers, saw the wealth and opportunity that cities like Sodom and Gomorrah represented, and he chose comfort over calling. He chose prosperity over the presence of God. He packed up his family, his servants, his livestock, and moved toward what seemed like paradise on earth. But paradise, as he was about to discover, had a price tag that no amount of wealth could ever pay. When Lot sees these two strangers approaching, something deep in his spirit recognizes their true nature. Maybe it's the way they carry themselves, or the light that seems to emanate from their presence even in human form. Maybe it's simply that after years of living in a city that had forgotten the very concept of holiness, he can still recognize it when it stands before him. Without hesitation, he rises from his place by the gate and approaches them. His greeting isn't casual, it's urgent, almost desperate. He bows low, his face nearly touching the dust, and speaks words that reveal just how dangerous he knows their situation truly is. "My lords," he says, "please turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you may rise early and go on your way." But here's what makes this moment so crucial. The angels initially refuse his invitation. They tell him they'll spend the night in the town square, exposed and vulnerable to whatever darkness prowls through Sodom's streets after sunset. Can you imagine the terror that must have gripped Lot's heart in that moment? He knows what happens in this city when night falls. He's seen the wickedness that emerges from the shadows, the violence that masquerades as entertainment, the corruption that has become so normalized that most residents don't even recognize it as evil anymore. Lot doesn't just invite them again. The scripture tells us he pressed them strongly. He pleads with them, argues with them, refuses to take no for an answer, because he understands something that most people miss about this story. These angels didn't come to Sodom to be impressed by its hospitality. They came to witness its depravity with their own eyes, to see if even 10 righteous people could be found within its walls. And Lot, despite his own compromises and failures, despite the choices that brought him to this place, still has enough spiritual discernment left to know that divine judgment is standing at the threshold. Finally, the angels agree to come to his house. They enter his home, they eat the food he prepares, they accept his protection. But their acceptance comes with a weight that Lot can feel pressing down on his shoulders like a mountain. Because when angels agree to stay under your roof, it means the time for pretending is over. It means the hour of decision has arrived. And then, as if summoned by some dark instinct, they come. The men of Sodom, young and old, surrounding Lot's house like a pack of wolves who've caught the scent of something they want to devour. Their voices rise in the darkness, demanding that Lot bring out his guests so they can know them. But this isn't the language of curiosity or even ordinary lust. This is the voice of corruption, so complete, so absolute, that it has lost all sense of boundary or restraint. Listen carefully to what happens next, because this is where the story takes a turn that most people never expect. Lot, this man who chose comfort over calling, who settled in Sodom despite knowing its reputation, who compromised his way into this impossible situation, suddenly finds a courage he didn't know he possessed. He steps outside his house, closing the door behind him, placing his own body between the mob and his guests. "Please, my brothers," he says, "do not act so wickedly." The word he uses for brothers isn't just politeness, it's recognition. These are his neighbors, people he's lived among for years, people whose children probably played with his children, people he's done business with in the marketplace. And yet here they are, transformed by the darkness that has consumed their city, demanding something so vile that even Lot, compromised as he is, cannot allow it to happen. But what he offers next reveals just how deeply the corruption of Sodom has affected even this righteous man. He offers them his own daughters instead. His virgin daughters, the children he brought into this cursed place, the innocents who never chose to live in a city marked for destruction. In his desperation to protect his guests, he's willing to sacrifice his own family. Now, before we judge Lot too harshly for this horrific offer, we need to understand something crucial about the ancient manners. It was sacred duty, a covenant world. Hospitality wasn't just goo bond that carried the weight of divine obligation. To betray a guest who had eaten at your table, who had accepted your protection, was to commit a sin so serious that it could bring judgment not just on you, but on your entire household. Lot understands that these aren't ordinary visitors. These are messengers of God, and their safety is worth more than his own life. But the mob isn't interested in his daughters. They want what they want, and they're not going to be denied. They surge forward, pressing against Lot, threatening to break down his door. And in that moment, as violence erupts in the darkness outside his home, something miraculous happens. Hands reach out from inside the house. Strong hands that grab Lot and pull him back inside just as the mob lunges forward. The door slams shut, and suddenly every man outside is struck blind, not metaphorically blind, not confused or disoriented, literally, physically blind. They stumble around in the darkness, groping for a door they can no longer find, their eyes sealed by divine power. And in that moment, Lot realizes with crystal clarity exactly who his guests really are. These aren't men, they're angels, messengers of the Most High God, and their presence in his home means only one thing: judgment is coming. And it's coming tonight. The angels don't waste time with explanations or comfort. Their voices cut through the chaos outside like swords through silk, urgent and commanding. "Do you have anyone else here?" they ask Lot. "Sons-in-law, sons, daughters, or anyone else in the city who belongs to you, get them out of this place, because we are going to destroy it. The outcry against this city has reached the Lord, and he has sent us to destroy it." Can you imagine the weight of those words hitting Lot's chest like physical blows? This isn't a warning about some distant future judgment. This isn't a call to repentance with time to spare. This is a death sentence with an execution scheduled for dawn. The angels aren't here to save the city. They're here to evacuate the righteous before they reduce it to ash and memory. Lot's mind races through the implications. His daughters are engaged to men of Sodom. His business connections, his property, his entire life is woven into the fabric of this doomed city. But there's no time for sentiment, no opportunity for gradual transition. The angel's message is devastatingly simple: run or burn. He stumbles out into the night, past the blind men, still groping helplessly for his door, and makes his way through streets that suddenly look different to his eyes. Every building he passes is already a tomb. Every person he encounters is walking dead. The familiar marketplace where he's conducted business for years now looks like a graveyard waiting for bodies. The sound of laughter drifting from taverns sounds like the final gasps of the condemned. He finds his sons-in-law, the young men engaged to his daughters, and delivers the message with shaking voice. "Up, get out of this place, for the Lord is about to destroy the city." But look at their response. They laugh. They think he's joking. They look at this man who's lived among them for years, who's shared their culture, their values, their way of life, and they cannot conceive that he's speaking literal truth. And why should they believe him? From their perspective, Lot is just another resident of Sodom, no more righteous than anyone else. He's participated in their economy, benefited from their prosperity, raised his children in their schools. What authority does he have to pronounce judgment? What right does he have to claim special revelation? They see his terror and interpret it as madness. They hear his urgency and dismiss it as delusion. This is the cruel irony of Lot's situation. Years of compromise have cost him his credibility at the very moment when his voice could save lives. His sons-in-law don't reject his message because they're more wicked than he is. They reject it because he's become so much like them that they can't imagine God would speak through him while remaining silent to them. As dawn approaches, the angels grow more insistent. Time is running out. The sun is beginning to paint the eastern sky with the first pale hints of light, and with sunrise comes destruction. "Hurry," they urge Lot. "Take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, or you will be swept away when the city is punished." But here's where the story takes its most shocking turn. Lot hesitates. After everything he's witnessed, after the angel's clear warning, after seeing divine power blind an entire mob, he lingers. The Hebrew word used here suggests more than momentary pause. It indicates extended delay, reluctant feet, a heart torn between survival and attachment. What could possibly cause a man to hesitate when angels are literally pulling him towards safety? What kind of hold did Sodom have on his soul that even the promise of imminent destruction couldn't break it cleanly? The answer reveals something disturbing about the nature of spiritual compromise. When you've invested your life in a place, when your identity becomes intertwined with your location, when your security depends on systems you know are corrupt, leaving becomes more than a physical act. It becomes a kind of death. Lot's hesitation isn't just about leaving a city. It's about abandoning an entire version of himself. In Sodom, he was a successful businessman, a respected citizen, a man of influence and property. Outside its walls, he would be a refugee with nothing but the clothes on his back. The angels weren't just asking him to relocate, they were asking him to be reborn. Finally, the angels act with divine impatience. The scripture says they seized him, his wife, and his daughters by the hands and brought them out of the city. This wasn't a gentle escort. This was a forcible extraction. They literally dragged this family from destruction because Lot's attachment to his old life had paralyzed his ability to choose his new one. Picture the scene as they're pulled through the streets of Sodom in those final moments before dawn. The city sleeps, unaware that these are its last hours. Children dream in beds that will soon be furnaces. Merchants plan for markets that will never open. Guards patrol walls that will crumble to dust before noon. And through it all, 4 figures move like ghosts, pulled by invisible hands toward a salvation they barely understand. The angels don't stop until they've brought the family outside the city limits. Only then do they release their grip and deliver final instructions that will determine whether this rescue mission ends in triumph or tragedy. "Flee for your lives," they command. "Don't look back and don't stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the mountains or you will be swept away." These aren't suggestions. They're survival protocols delivered with the authority of heaven itself. Don't look back because what you see will paralyze you with horror. Don't stop in the plain because the destruction will spread beyond the city walls. Don't trust your own judgment about when you're safe because divine wrath operates on a scale beyond human comprehension. But even now, even with angels speaking directly to him, Lot tries to negotiate. "No, my lords, please," he cries. "Your servant has found favor in your eyes, and you have shown great kindness to me in sparing my life. But I can't flee to the mountains. This disaster will overtake me and I'll die. Look, here is a town near enough to run to, and it is small. Let me flee to it. It is very small, isn't it? Then my life will be spared." The audacity of this moment is breathtaking. Here's a man who just witnessed angels blind an entire mob with a gesture, who's been forcibly dragged from certain death, who's receiving direct commands from messengers of the Most High God, and he's still trying to manage the terms of his own rescue. He's still clinging to the illusion that he has some control over circumstances that are completely beyond his power to influence. The angel's response reveals something beautiful about divine patience even in the midst of judgment. "Very well," he says, "I will grant this request too. I will not overthrow the town you speak of. But flee there quickly, because I cannot do anything until you reach it." The small city Lot chooses becomes known as Zoar, which means little, and it survives solely because one frightened man couldn't quite trust God's original plan for his salvation. As they run through the pre-dawn darkness toward Zoar, Lot's wife struggles with her own version of his hesitation. Every step takes her farther from everything she's ever known. Behind them lies the life she built, the friends she made, the home she decorated, the social position she enjoyed. Ahead lies uncertainty, poverty, exile from everything familiar. The pull of the past grows stronger with every step forward. And then, just as the sun breaks over the horizon, just as they near the safety of Zoar, she makes the choice that seals her fate forever. She looks back. The moment Lot's wife turns her head toward Sodom, time seems to freeze around her. Her foot hovers above the dusty ground. Her hand reaches toward her husband's arm. Her mouth opens as if to call his name. But no sound emerges. Instead, something far more terrible happens. Something that transforms her from a living, breathing woman into a monument of salt that will stand as a warning for generations to come. What exactly did she see in that fatal glance backward? The scripture doesn't tell us, but we can imagine the horror that met her eyes. Fire wasn't falling from heaven like rain. This was something far more catastrophic, far more absolute. The very elements of creation were being reversed, unmade, returned to the chaos from which they came. The sky itself was burning, and from its flaming depths poured destruction so pure, so concentrated, that it didn't just kill, it erased. Buildings weren't collapsing, they were vaporizing. People weren't screaming. They were being consumed so quickly that sound itself couldn't escape their lips. The fertile valley that had attracted Lot's attention all those years ago was transforming into a wasteland of salt and sulfur that would remain barren for millennia. And somewhere in that apocalyptic vision, Lot's wife saw something that her human mind couldn't process, couldn't survive, couldn't turn away from. The pillar of salt that she became wasn't a punishment for disobedience, though disobedience certainly played a role. It was the inevitable result of a mortal soul trying to witness divine judgment with naked eyes. She saw the face of God's wrath unveiled, and like Moses on Mount Sinai, no human being can look upon such glory and live. But unlike Moses, who was protected by the cleft of the rock, she stood exposed on the open plain with nothing to shield her from the full force of divine revelation. Lot feels the change before he sees it. The hand that was reaching for his arm suddenly stops moving. The footsteps that had been matching his pace fall silent. He turns, and where his wife should be, where the woman who shared his bed and bore his children should be running beside him, there stands a white crystalline figure, frozen forever in the act of looking back toward everything they lost. The grief that hits him in that moment is unlike anything he's ever experienced. It's not just the loss of his wife. It's the realization that even in the midst of miraculous rescue, even with angels guiding their steps, even with divine mercy extending beyond all reasonable expectation, destruction can still reach out and claim those we love most. His daughters scream behind him, but their voices sound distant, muffled, as if they're calling to him from across an enormous chasm. And still, they must keep running. Because the destruction spreading behind them doesn't pause for grief, doesn't slow for mourning, doesn't recognize the human need to stop and process trauma. The angel's warning echoes in his ears. Don't stop anywhere in the plain. Not for his wife's pillar, not for his own breaking heart, not for his daughter's terror. The fire of God's judgment moves faster than human legs can carry them, and their only hope lies in reaching Zoar before it catches up. As they stumble through the gates of the small city, the ground beneath their feet begins to shake. Not the gentle tremor of distant thunder, but the deep, bone-rattling convulsion of earth itself crying out in agony. Behind them, the horizon erupts in flames that reach so high they seem to lick the very foundations of heaven. The sound that follows isn't the roar of ordinary fire. It's the voice of creation being undone, the cosmic scream of matter returning to void. The people of Zoar wake to find refugees at their gates and hell consuming the landscape beyond their walls. Some rush to offer help and shelter. Others stand paralyzed by the magnitude of what they're witnessing. A few fall to their knees in terror, finally understanding that the stories their grandparents told about divine judgment weren't mythology but prophecy. The God who created the world with words is demonstrating that he can just as easily uncreate it with fire, but Lot barely notices their reactions. He's staring back toward the pillar that was once his wife, watching as the smoke and flame obscure even that final monument to his former life. Everything is gone. His house, his business, his social connections, his wealth, his security, his identity as a successful man in a prosperous city. All of it reduced to ash and memory in a single morning. Even his wife, the one person who shared his journey from the beginning, has been transformed into a warning that others will point to for generations. Yet somehow, impossibly, he's still alive. His daughters are still breathing beside him. They've escaped the impossible, survived the unsurvivable, been delivered from destruction by direct divine intervention. They are living miracles, breathing testimonies to the mercy of God, even in the midst of his wrath. But survival, Lot is discovering, comes with its own unique form of suffering. The trauma of what they've witnessed doesn't fade with distance. If anything, it intensifies as the adrenaline wears off and the full reality of their situation sets in. They are refugees now, strangers in a strange land, completely dependent on the charity of others. Lot, who once sat in the gates of Sodom as a man of influence and authority, now sits by the roadside as a beggar whose only possessions are the clothes he wore while fleeing for his life. His daughters, who grew up as daughters of a wealthy merchant, are now homeless orphans whose marriage prospects died with their city. The young men they were engaged to, the friends they played with, the servants who cared for them, the tutors who educated them, everyone they've ever known outside their immediate family is dead. They are sole survivors of a civilization that has been erased so completely it might as well have never existed. But the physical losses, devastating as they are, pale in comparison to the psychological wounds that will never fully heal. How do you recover from watching your entire world burn? How do you sleep at night when you've seen the sky itself catch fire? How do you trust in tomorrow when you've witnessed how quickly everything familiar can disappear forever? Lot finds himself jumping at shadows, flinching from loud noises, scanning the horizon constantly for signs of approaching destruction. Every sunset reminds him of that terrible dawn. Every column of smoke from a cooking fire triggers memories of the inferno that consumed his former life. His hands shake when he tries to eat. His voice cracks when he attempts to pray. The man who once hosted angels in his home now struggles to believe that God's mercy extends beyond that single night of rescue. His daughters deal with their trauma differently, but no less severely. The older one becomes obsessively protective of what little they have left, hoarding scraps of food and worn clothing as if preparing for another catastrophe. The younger one swings between periods of numb silence and explosive rage at the God who saved them but couldn't save their mother. Both of them have nightmares that wake them, screaming in the middle of the night, visions of salt pillars and burning cities that will haunt them for the rest of their lives. The people of Zoar try to be kind, but their charity comes mixed with curiosity and suspicion. They want to hear the story over and over again, to understand exactly what happened to the cities of the plain. But each retelling forces Lot to relive the horror, to describe in detail the supernatural events that no human vocabulary was ever designed to capture. How do you explain what it looks like when angels blind an entire crowd? How do you describe the sound of a city dying all at once? Some listeners believe his account and react with appropriate awe and terror. Others clearly think he's lost his mind from grief and trauma, that the destruction was natural, and his claims of angelic intervention are the delusions of a broken man. Still, others seem to blame him for what happened, as if his presence in Sodom somehow caused the judgment to fall, as if the destruction followed him to their city like a contagious disease. The worst part is that sometimes, in his darkest moments, Lot wonders if they might be right. He remembers his choice to settle in Sodom in the first place, his gradual accommodation to its culture, his willingness to offer his daughters to the mob rather than surrender his guests. He thinks about all the years he lived in that wicked city without raising his voice in protest, without calling his neighbors to repentance, without standing as a beacon of righteousness in the darkness. Was he truly righteous, as the scriptures would later call him? Or was he simply the least wicked person in an extraordinarily wicked place? Did God save him because of his faith, or merely because of his family connection to Abraham? These questions torment him during sleepless nights when the weight of survival feels heavier than the burden of death might have been. The truth is that Lot's rescue wasn't based on his perfect righteousness but on God's perfect mercy. His survival wasn't earned through flawless obedience, but granted through divine grace that operates beyond human understanding. Even his hesitation, his negotiation with the angels, his wife's fatal backward glance, none of these failures could override the decision heaven had already made to preserve this family as witnesses to both divine judgment and divine compassion. But understanding this truth intellectually and feeling it emotionally are two very different things. Lot struggles with survivor's guilt that gnaws at his soul like acid. Why him? Why his daughters? Why not his sons-in-law, who might have been no more wicked than he was? Why not his wife, who had walked beside him through decades of marriage? Why not the children of Sodom, who never chose to be born in a cursed city? These are questions that have no easy answers, mysteries that will follow him to his grave. But they are also questions that millions of survivors have asked throughout history, in every generation, in every tragedy. Why do some escape when others perish? Why does mercy fall on some while justice claims others? Why does God save whom he saves? And why does he allow the rest to face the consequences of their choices? The story of Lot's survival is ultimately not about his worthiness, but about God's sovereignty. It's about divine purposes that operate on scales too vast for human comprehension, about mercy that flows from sources deeper than human deserving, about grace that rescues not because we are righteous, but because righteousness itself demands that some inevitably brings. As months pass in Zoar, Lot begins to be saved from the destruction that's Nineveh to realize that his survival story is far from over. The angels saved him from Sodom's destruction, but they couldn't save him from the ongoing challenge of rebuilding a life from ashes. Every day presents new tests of faith, new opportunities to trust God's plan despite not understanding it, new chances to choose hope over despair. And slowly, gradually, a disturbing pattern begins to emerge in his daughter's behavior. They watch their father aging rapidly under the weight of trauma and loss. They see how the other refugees look at them, not as eligible marriage prospects, but as damaged goods, survivors of a cursed city who might carry its contamination with them. They observe how their bloodline, once connected to the promise given to Abraham, now seems destined to die out in exile and poverty. The older daughter begins to whisper to the younger one during their father's fitful sleep. They have conversations that grow more desperate, more calculated, more willing to cross lines that should never be crossed. Because sometimes, when everything familiar has been destroyed, when all normal paths to the future have been cut off, when survival itself seems to require abandoning everything you once believed about right and wrong, people make choices that define not just their own destinies but the destinies of entire nations yet to be born. What happens next in Lot's story will shock you more than anything we've uncovered so far, because the man who escaped the fire of divine judgment was about to face a different kind of destruction, one that wouldn't come from heaven, but from the broken hearts of his own daughters. The older daughter's whispers in the darkness weren't random thoughts born of grief. They were calculated plans emerging from desperation so deep it had consumed her ability to think clearly about consequences. She looked at their situation with the cold logic of someone who believed the normal rules no longer applied. Their father was aging rapidly, broken by trauma and loss. The men of Zor viewed them as contaminated survivors, untouchable remnants of a cursed civilization. Their bloodline, connected to the promises God made to Abraham, seemed destined to end with them. But here's what she told her younger sister in those midnight conversations. Here's the reasoning that would lead to one of the most disturbing episodes in all of Scripture. "Our father is old," she said, "and there is no man on earth to come into us according to the way of all the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, so that we may preserve the lineage of our father." Can you hear the twisted logic in those words? Can you sense how trauma had warped their understanding of morality, of trust, of God's ability to provide for their future? They weren't thinking like daughters anymore. They were thinking like the last survivors of their species, willing to do anything, sacrifice anything, cross any boundary to ensure that something of their family line would continue. The wine they chose wasn't accidental. In their refugee existence, alcohol had become their father's only escape from the nightmares that plagued his sleep. Every evening, he would drink until the memories blurred, until the sound of his wife's scream faded, until the image of that salt pillar stopped haunting his dreams. His daughters had watched this ritual night after night, and now they saw in his weakness their opportunity. What happened next violates every natural law of family, every boundary of human decency, every principle that separates civilization from chaos. On 2 consecutive nights, these desperate young women implemented their plan. They made their father drink wine until his judgment failed, until his awareness dimmed, until he could no longer distinguish between right and wrong, between daughter and stranger, between survival and sin. The Scripture records these events with brutal honesty, but without graphic detail. It simply states that both daughters lay with their father, that he was unaware when they lay down or when they arose, that both of them conceived children from these encounters. But the implications of what happened in that cave stretch far beyond the immediate horror of the acts themselves. Think about what this means for Lot's story of survival. He escaped the fire of Sodom only to fall into a different kind of destruction. He was rescued from external judgment only to face internal collapse. The angels saved his body from the flames, but they couldn't protect his soul from the ongoing devastation of choices made in desperation and pain. His daughter's actions weren't born from wickedness in the traditional sense. They were born from a kind of spiritual blindness that trauma can create, a narrowing of vision that makes extreme solutions seem not just reasonable but necessary. They had witnessed the end of their world, seen divine judgment erase everything familiar, watched their mother die for the crime of looking backward. In their minds, normal morality was a luxury they could no longer afford. But here's what they couldn't see in their desperation. Here's what their trauma had hidden from their understanding. God's promises to Abraham didn't depend on their schemes to preserve the family line. The same God who rescued them from Sodom could provide husbands, could open wombs, could ensure the continuation of his covenant through means that didn't require the violation of every sacred boundary. Their lack of faith in God's provision led them to take matters into their own hands in the most devastating way possible. And the consequences of their actions would ripple through history for generations, creating enemies for God's people that would plague them for centuries to come. The children born from these unholy unions became the fathers of two nations that would become perpetual thorns in Israel's side: Moab and Ammon, peoples whose very existence would serve as a constant reminder of what happens when survival instincts override moral boundaries, when human logic replaces divine trust, when the trauma of escape becomes the catalyst for new forms of destruction. But even in this darkest chapter of Lot's story, we see something that reveals the character of the God who saved him. The Scripture doesn't hide these shameful events. It doesn't sanitize Lot's failure or excuse his daughter's actions. It records them with unflinching honesty, preserving them as warnings for future generations about the ongoing dangers that survivors face long after their initial rescue. This is what makes Lot's story so relevant to anyone who's ever escaped one form of destruction only to find themselves vulnerable to another. Physical salvation doesn't automatically guarantee spiritual protection. Being rescued from external judgment doesn't immunize you against internal collapse. The same trauma that drives you to seek God's help can later tempt you to abandon God's ways when His solutions seem too slow or uncertain. Lot's daughters represent everyone who's ever looked at their circumstances and decided that God's promises aren't enough, that His timing is too slow, that His methods are too restrictive for their desperate situation. They embody the human tendency to take control when we feel out of control, to break boundaries when normal paths seem blocked, to justify extreme actions by pointing to extreme circumstances. And Lot himself represents everyone who's ever been so broken by their experiences that they lost the ability to guard what should be protected, to maintain what should be maintained, to resist what should be resisted. His wine-soaked stupor wasn't just physical intoxication. It was spiritual abdication, a surrender of responsibility that left him vulnerable to manipulation and exploitation. Yet even here, even in this cave where unspeakable things happened under cover of darkness, God's sovereignty wasn't overthrown. His plans weren't derailed. His purposes weren't frustrated. The same divine hand that guided Lot's escape from Sodom would somehow weave even these shameful events into a larger tapestry of redemption that human eyes couldn't yet perceive. The nations that emerged from this darkness would indeed become enemies of God's people. But they would also serve divine purposes, testing Israel's faithfulness, refining their character, demonstrating the consequences of compromise, and the importance of maintaining holy boundaries. Even the products of human failure would become instruments in God's hands for accomplishing His will. This doesn't excuse what happened in that cave. It doesn't minimize the horror of what Lot's daughters did or absolve their father of his failures. But it does reveal something profound about the nature of divine grace, about God's ability to work through human brokenness, about the way sovereign purposes can encompass even the darkest chapters of human experience. As news of what happened in the cave eventually spread, Lot's reputation suffered yet another devastating blow. The man, who had once been respected in Sodom's gates, who had hosted angels in his home, who had been personally rescued by divine intervention, was now whispered about as a broken drunk who couldn't even protect his own family boundaries. His survival story, which should have been a testimony to God's mercy, became instead a cautionary tale about the ongoing vulnerability of those who escape one form of destruction only to fall into another. The weight of shame that settled on his shoulders was almost unbearable. Every morning brought fresh reminders of what he had lost, what he had failed to protect, what he had allowed to happen under his own roof. The salt pillar of his wife seemed like a merciful fate compared to the living death of surviving with such knowledge, such guilt, such awareness of how completely his life had unraveled. His daughters, meanwhile, dealt with their own complex mixture of emotions. There was relief that their plan had worked, that their bloodlines would continue, that they wouldn't die childless in exile. But there was also horror at what they had done, guilt that grew heavier with each passing day, and the terrible knowledge that their children would forever carry the mark of their conception. The pregnancies themselves became daily reminders of the night that changed everything. As their bodies swelled with life, as they felt the movement of children within them, they couldn't escape the reality of how those lives began. Every kick, every flutter, every moment of joy at impending motherhood was shadowed by the memory of wine and darkness and boundaries crossed in desperation. When the children were born, they carried names that told their story without shame or concealment. Moab, whose name means from father, and Ben-Ami, meaning son of my people. These weren't attempts to hide the truth of their origin, but bold declarations that their mothers felt no shame about their desperate choices. In their minds, they had done what survival required, and they would own the consequences without apology. But names carry power, and these names would echo through history as reminders of what happens when human logic replaces divine trust, when survival instincts override moral boundaries, when the trauma of escape becomes the foundation for new forms of bondage. The children themselves would grow up knowing their story, carrying their origins like badges of both honor and shame, founders of nations that would never quite escape the shadow of their beginning. Lot lived to see his grandsons grow into men, to watch them establish the tribes that would bear their names, to witness the beginning of peoples that would outlast his own memory. But he also lived with the knowledge that his survival story, which began with such dramatic divine intervention, had devolved into something that brought more shame than glory to the God who rescued him. The man who escaped Sodom's destruction never fully escaped the destruction that followed him into exile. His body survived the fire and brimstone, but his soul remained trapped in cycles of trauma and poor choices that seemed to generate their own forms of judgment. He was living proof that physical rescue is only the beginning of salvation, not its completion. Yet, in the broader sweep of biblical history, even Lot's failures would serve purposes beyond his understanding. His story would become a warning about the ongoing challenges that survivors face, about the ways trauma can distort judgment, about the importance of maintaining moral boundaries even in desperate circumstances. Future generations would read his account and recognize their own struggles with the aftermath of rescue, their own temptations to take control when God's solution seemed inadequate. And perhaps most importantly, Lot's story would demonstrate that divine grace extends even to those whose survival stories don't end with triumph and restoration, whose rescues don't lead to lives of obvious righteousness and blessing. Sometimes being saved from one form of destruction is simply the beginning of a longer, more complex journey toward healing and wholeness. Sometimes survival itself is the miracle, even when what follows survival looks nothing like what we expected salvation to produce. The cave where unspeakable things happened became, in its own way, as significant as the burning cities they escaped. It represented the truth that human brokenness doesn't end with divine intervention, that being rescued by God doesn't automatically solve all the problems that drove us to need rescue in the first place. It showed that sometimes the most dangerous enemies we face aren't the ones pursuing us from behind, but the ones traveling with us, hidden in our own trauma, our own desperation, our own willingness to compromise when the pressure becomes too great. And so we arrive at perhaps the most haunting truth of Lot's entire journey. The man who witnessed divine judgment in its purest form, who saw cities erased from existence in a single morning, who was personally escorted to safety by messengers of the Most High, never truly escaped the spiritual devastation of what he experienced. His body survived the flames, but his soul remained trapped in the ashes. Years passed in that cave, and with each passing season the weight of shame grew heavier on Lot's shoulders. The wine that had once numbed his nightmares now became his constant companion, a liquid barrier between himself and the crushing reality of what his life had become. The man who once sat in the gates of Sodom as a respected elder was now a broken hermit, hiding in the mountains, afraid to show his face in civilized company. But here's what makes Lot's story so devastatingly relevant to our modern world. How many of us have experienced our own versions of divine rescue only to find ourselves struggling with the aftermath? How many have escaped one form of destruction only to discover that the real battle was just beginning? How many survivors carry wounds that no external deliverance can heal? The cave where Lot spent his final years became a symbol of something far more universal than one man's personal tragedy. It represented the hidden struggles that every survivor faces, the private battles that rage long after the public rescue is complete. The angels could snatch his body from the flames, but they couldn't extract the trauma from his memory, couldn't erase the guilt from his conscience, couldn't restore the innocence that perished with his wife on the plains of Sodom. His daughters, now mothers themselves, watched their father deteriorate with a mixture of pity and resentment. They had acted out of desperation to preserve their lineage, but in saving their bloodline, they had destroyed their family. The children they bore carried the DNA of survival, but also the spiritual inheritance of compromise. Every time they looked into their sons' faces, they saw both hope for the future and reminders of the price they paid to secure it. The boys grew up knowing their story. In a world where genealogies mattered, where family histories were passed down like precious heirlooms, there was no hiding the circumstances of their conception. Moab and Ben-Ami learned early that they were children of desperation, products of choices made when normal options seemed impossible. This knowledge shaped them in ways that would echo through generations. But what's truly remarkable about this chapter of Lot's story is how it reveals the complex nature of divine mercy. God didn't strike down Lot for his failures. He didn't send another judgment to punish the cave dwellers for their sins. Instead, he allowed the consequences to unfold naturally, permitted the shame to run its course, let the broken family experience the full weight of choices made in darkness. This wasn't cruelty. It was a different kind of mercy, the mercy that allows people to learn from their mistakes without destroying them in the process. Lot's survival became a living testimony to both divine grace and human frailty, proof that being chosen by God doesn't exempt you from the ongoing struggle with your own broken nature. As word of what happened in the cave eventually reached the outside world, Lot's name became associated not with miraculous rescue, but with moral failure. The man, who should have been remembered as a righteous survivor, became instead a cautionary tale about the dangers of compromise, about what happens when trauma overwhelms wisdom, about the way shame can compound itself until it becomes its own form of prison. Travelers passing through the region would sometimes catch glimpses of the old man sitting at the mouth of his cave, staring out at the distant wasteland where Sodom once stood. They saw a figure bent by more than age, crushed by burdens that couldn't be shared, carrying secrets that had transformed him from survivor into hermit. Some recognized him and whispered among themselves about the fall of a man who had once walked with angels. The salt pillar of his wife, still visible on the plains below, became a kind of monument to their shared tragedy. Visitors would point it out to their children, telling the story of the woman who looked back and the man who wished he could have died with her. The pillar stood unchanged, while everything around it shifted with time. A permanent reminder of a moment when curiosity overcame obedience, when human nature proved stronger than divine warning. Lot would sometimes make the dangerous journey down to stand beside that pillar, to touch the crystalline surface that had once been warm flesh, to whisper apologies that could never be heard by ears that no longer existed. These pilgrimages became his only form of worship, his way of maintaining connection with the divine drama that had defined his existence. In those moments, standing beside his wife's transformed remains, he felt closest to understanding the magnitude of what they had all experienced. The isolation of the cave began to affect his mind in ways that went beyond the damage caused by wine and grief. He started hearing voices in the wind, seeing faces in the shadows, carrying on conversations with people who existed only in his memory. The boundary between past and present blurred until he was living simultaneously in multiple timelines, reliving the night of escape while experiencing the daily reality of exile. His daughters watched this deterioration with growing alarm, but they were powerless to stop it. Their own guilt made them reluctant to seek help from others, afraid that exposing their father's condition would lead to questions about what had driven him to such extremes. They had become prisoners of their own choices, trapped by secrets that grew heavier with each passing year. The children, meanwhile, absorbed the dysfunction around them like sponges soaking up poison. They learned that survival sometimes requires crossing unthinkable boundaries, that desperate circumstances can justify almost any action, that the normal rules of morality are luxuries that only the secure can afford. These lessons would shape the cultures they eventually established, creating societies that valued survival over righteousness, pragmatism over principle. As Moab and Ben-Ami grew into young men, they began to chafe against the isolation of cave life. They wanted to explore the world beyond their mountain hideout, to meet other people, to discover what opportunities might exist for the sons of a legendary survivor. But every attempt to venture into civilization brought them face to face with their family's reputation, with the whispered stories that preceded them wherever they went. They were simultaneously famous and infamous, blessed and cursed, survivors and outcasts. People knew their names but crossed the street to avoid them. Merchants would trade with them but wouldn't invite them home. Young women might be curious about them, but their fathers would forbid any serious relationships. They discovered that being the children of Lot meant carrying a burden that could never be fully set down. This social rejection drove them to seek their own territories, to establish communities where their origins would be strengths rather than weaknesses, where survival skills mattered more than moral pedigree. They became founders not by choice but by necessity, leaders not because they sought power, but because isolation had left them no other option. The nations that emerged from their leadership carried the DNA of their origin story. They were societies built by survivors for survivors, cultures that understood trauma but struggled with trust, peoples who valued pragmatism but found it difficult to embrace higher principles. The Moabites and Ammonites would become exactly what you'd expect from communities founded by children of desperate choices. And through it all, Lot continued his slow fade into irrelevance and madness. The man who had been personally escorted from destruction by divine messengers ended his days as a broken hermit, talking to shadows and drinking away memories that refused to be silenced. His survival story, which should have been a triumph of divine mercy, became instead a tragedy of human limitation. Yet even in his deteriorated state, even in the depths of his shame and isolation, Lot retained one crucial understanding that never left him. He knew he had been saved by grace, not merit. He understood that his escape from Sodom wasn't based on his righteousness but on God's mercy. This knowledge, buried beneath layers of trauma and guilt, remained the one stable foundation in his collapsing world. The final years of his life were spent in a strange form of worship, a broken but sincere gratitude for rescue he knew he hadn't deserved. He would sit for hours staring at the horizon, remembering the night when angels pulled him from certain death, reliving the moment when divine hands literally dragged him toward salvation. Whatever else had gone wrong, whatever mistakes had followed, that night remained pure in his memory. When death finally came for Lot, it found him not in despair, but in a kind of peace that surprised even his daughters. His last words, whispered in the darkness of the cave where so much had gone wrong, were not curses or complaints, but simple expressions of gratitude. He died acknowledging that being saved from Sodom, even with all the complications that followed, was still the greatest mercy he had ever received. His death marked the end of the last living witness to one of history's most dramatic displays of divine judgment. With Lot's passing, the first-hand memory of angels walking among men, of cities consumed by heavenly fire, of divine rescue performed by supernatural hands, passed from living testimony into recorded history. The age of direct angelic intervention seemed to close with the closing of his eyes, but the story he left behind continued to resonate through generations. His account became a template for understanding how divine rescue works, how survival itself can be both blessing and burden, how being chosen by God doesn't exempt you from the ongoing struggle with your own humanity. Future survivors would read his story and recognize their own experiences, their own struggles with the aftermath of deliverance. The cave where he died became a landmark of sorts, a place where pilgrims would come to contemplate the complex nature of divine mercy and human frailty. Some came seeking encouragement, finding hope in the fact that even broken survivors could be objects of divine grace. Others came as a warning, learning from Lot's failures about the dangers of compromise and the importance of maintaining moral boundaries even in desperate circumstances. The nations founded by his grandsons continued to grow and prosper, establishing territories that would remain on maps for centuries to come. But they carried within their cultural DNA the contradictions of their origin, the tension between survival instincts and moral principles that had defined their founders' story. They became peoples who understood hardship but struggled with holiness, who valued strength but found it difficult to embrace righteousness. And somewhere in the wasteland that had once been Sodom and Gomorrah, a pillar of salt continued to stand as a monument to the night when heaven and earth collided, when divine judgment met human rebellion, when one family's desperate flight from destruction changed the course of history forever. The pillar weathered storms and endured seasons, a permanent reminder that some choices have consequences that outlast the people who make them. Lot's final breath escaped his lips like a whisper carried away by the mountain wind, and with it died the last living connection to that terrible night when angels walked the earth and cities burned like candles in the darkness. But death, as he discovered in those final moments, was not the end of his story. It was merely the closing of one chapter in a narrative that would echo through eternity, reverberating in ways he could never have imagined during his years of exile and shame. The cave fell silent after his passing, but the silence was pregnant with something profound. His daughters, now middle-aged women, worn down by years of carrying secrets too heavy for human hearts, stood over his still form and felt something shift in the spiritual atmosphere around them. The oppressive weight that had pressed down on their family for decades seemed to lift slightly, as if his death had somehow released them from a bondage they hadn't fully understood while he lived. But freedom from the past doesn't come automatically with the grave. As they prepared their father's body for burial, wrapping him in the simple cloths they could afford, his daughters found themselves confronting questions that had haunted them throughout his final years. What legacy were they passing to their sons? What inheritance of trauma and compromise would define the generations that followed? The children of their desperate choices were now young men, ready to take their place in a world that neither welcomed nor understood them. Moab had grown into a man whose very presence commanded attention, not through beauty or charm, but through an intensity that spoke of survival forged in fire. He carried himself like someone who'd learned early that the world owed him nothing, that every advantage had to be seized and every opportunity defended. His eyes held the wariness of someone who had grown up knowing his origin story, understanding that he was both blessed and cursed by circumstances beyond his control. Ben-Ami possessed a different kind of strength, quieter but no less formidable. Where his brother burned with barely contained energy, Ben-Ami smoldered with calculated patience. He had learned to read people's reactions to his name, to navigate the complex social dynamics that surrounded his family's reputation. His survival strategy was adaptation, becoming whatever the situation required while never forgetting where he came from. Both young men understood that their father's death marked more than the end of a life. It represented the closing of an era, the final severing of their connection to the world that existed before the Great Burning. They were now truly the first generation of the after-times, the founders of something entirely new, unburdened by direct memory of what had been lost, but shaped entirely by the consequences of that loss. The burial itself became a moment of unexpected revelation. As they carried Lot's body from the cave that had sheltered and imprisoned him for so many years, they found themselves retracing the path he had walked during his midnight visits to his wife's pillar. The journey down the mountainside felt like a pilgrimage, each step taking them deeper into the landscape of their family's trauma and triumph. When they reached the spot where the salt pillars stood, something extraordinary happened. The crystalline figure that had been their stepmother, frozen forever in the act of looking backward, began to crack. Not violently, not dramatically, but with the slow, inevitable progression of something that had fulfilled its purpose and was ready to return to dust. As they watched in amazement, the pillar that had stood unchanged through seasons and storms began to crumble, as if Lot's death had somehow released it from its eternal vigil. The symbolism wasn't lost on them. The woman who had been unable to let go of the past was finally free to rest. Her monument to backward looking dissolved at the very moment when forward motion became possible for her family. It was as if the universe itself was declaring that the time for looking back had ended, that the future demanded their full attention now. They buried Lot in sight of where his wife's pillar had stood, marking his grave with stones gathered from the wasteland that had once been fertile plain. The simple cairn they built became the first monument in what would eventually become a sacred site, a place where future generations would come to remember not just one man's story, but the complex nature of divine mercy and human frailty. As earth covered their father's remains, Moab and Ben-Ami felt the weight of inheritance settling on their shoulders. But this wasn't the inheritance of property or position that most sons received. This was the inheritance of story, of identity forged in extremity, of the responsibility to carry forward lessons learned in the crucible of survival. They were inheriting not just their father's blood, but his burden, not just his DNA, but his destiny. So, there you have it. The shocking truth about Sodom's secret survivor. A story that reveals how divine rescue is just the beginning, not the end. Lot's journey shows us that being chosen by God doesn't exempt us from the ongoing battle with our own broken nature. His survival became a testament to grace that extends even to those whose stories don't end in triumph. Remember, sometimes the most dangerous enemies aren't behind us, but within us. What will you do when your moment of choice arrives?